Okay, so today's topic of Kaf Amud Aleph 20a at the top. So the Talmud tells us Amar Elfa records. He taught, of course, we remember Elfa from Maseches Tanis, that he was the one who stood on the mast of the ship. He said, if there's anybody who could test me and I don't know it, then I'll fall into the ocean. He was the one who went into business, but he still remained a great Torah scholar. He said, Behema Bershus Arabim. So here, Ilfa teaches us if there's an animal in the public domain, upashta tzavara, it sticks forth its neck, va'achla, and eats, may al gabe chaverta. So if there's an animal in the public domain, it sticks forth its neck and eats from on top of another animal that's also walking in the public domain, chayeves. We're going to say that this animal is liable for shane. It's liable for eating. My taima. What's the reasoning? What's the reasoning why we're going to say that this animal is going to be liable? Isn't it in the public domain? So the Gemara explains, because vis-a-vis her friend, meaning to say, each animal's personal space, vis-a-vis the other animal, it's like it's their own domain. So therefore, that the owner of this animal is violating the space of the other animal, and so therefore it's like the domain of the nizak. So the Gemara says, "Lema Messiah." Let's bring a support for Ilfa's teaching from the Brisa. From a Brisa, what does the Brisa teach us? Let's say a man has a box that's hanging over his back. Upashta tzavarav, and the animal sticks its neck out and eats from it. Mimenu chayaves. So under those circumstances, you're going to be liable for the animal eating from the box that's hanging over the back. So isn't it the same logic? It must be the same logic that if a person has something in their personal space and the animal eats it, it's like eating in the domain of the other person. Gemara says no. That brisa can't be explained to give us a strong proof for Ilfa's statement, because Kida Amar Rava, as Rava said, in a different context, Bikofetzes. That's talking about a case where the animal was jumping. And Hachinami, in this case also, perhaps this brisa is talking about where the animal jumped. And so therefore it's Bikofetzes. And therefore, since the animal is jumping, therefore this is going to be considered mishuna. It's different. And so therefore the owner of the animal that ate is going to be responsible for half damages, like goring in the public domain. But we can't prove from here that if an animal eats in the normal manner, just eats off of the back of another animal, that is going to be shane in the public domain, and shane in the Rishus HaNizak, and you're going to be liable. So where did Rava teach us law about kofetzes? Where did Rava teach us law about the animal jumping? Ahada Amar Rav Oshaya. Now it's Rav Oshaya taught behema bershus harabim. Let's say that Rabbi Oshaya taught about an animal that was in the public domain. Holcha va'achla. And if this animal in the public domain is walking along, and while it's walking along, it's eating, petura. We're going to say it's exempt. But if it stops and it eats, chayeves, we're going to say it's liable. And the Gemara says, let's analyze this brisa. Ma'ishna holcha. Why is it different if it's walking? Do we say it's exempt? To orchehu, because that's a normal manner in which an animal goes in the public domain. Nami orchehu. Well, if an animal stops in the public domain, it should also be regular behavior of the animal, and so therefore it shouldn't be liable for eating. So therefore the Gemara says, Amarava b'kofetzes. Now Rava is saying Rabbi Oshaya is not talking about us. Rabbi Oshaya is not talking about an animal that's just simply stopping and eating in a normal manner. Because obviously under those circumstances, the owner of the animal will be exempt from tooth in the public domain. But rather what we're referring to is where animal jumped up and it stood on its hind legs. It's omedes. It jumps on its hind legs, which it typically doesn't do. And so therefore we're going to say that the owner of the animal is responsible not for shane, But for Karen, because it's a tam, it's goring in an unusual manner, and therefore he has to pay half damages. So by Rabbi Zera, so Rabbi Zera now asks the question about tooth. He says, Misgalgal mahu. So if it rolls, what will be the law? Basically, what's the law with respect to where a food item where the animal, if it eats in the public domain, is going to be exempt, but in the private domain is liable. But let's say the animal rolled the food item from one domain into the other domain and ate it there. Should we look at it as the place where the food started, or should we look at it as the place where he actually ended up eating from the animal? So the Gemara says, "Hey Chidami, what's the scenario?" So do we want to say Kagon the Kaima Amir Bershus Hayachet? Do we want to say we're talking about a case where there was, let's say, a bale of straw that was standing in the private domain, the Kamaskalga of Asim Rishus Hayachet Rishus Harabim? Mai. Do we want to say we're talking about a case where the straw was in the private domain, and then the animal moved the straw from the private domain into the public domain? Is that our case? So the Gemara says, let's answer that case from a brisa. Gemara says, Tashma, let's come and try and answer this case. Tashma, the Tani Rebbe Chia, let's say you have a burden that's partially inside and partially it's outside. So you have a bundle of food, and let's say you have a basket full of food, and then partially it was in the private domain and partially outside the private domain. Whatever the animal eats inside is the animal is liable for. Whatever the animal eats outside, the animal is exempt. And my love, are we talking about a case where miskalgo va'asi, where the animal pushed it outside? And we see from here that the animal, you're going to be exempt for the stuff in the public domain, even though the animal pushed it. Mora says, no, well, basically, we're not talking about a case where the animal, we're not talking about, that's not the circumstance, because you could say that the brisa means to say, if the animal pushed it from one domain to another and ate it, means to say that we initially thought that the brisa was talking about whatever was initially inside is liable for, whenever is initially outside is exempt. No, that's not what we're saying. We're talking about a case where he pushed it, and so therefore it's not able to we're not able to prove it in that case. So Ibai is saying alternatively, or alternatively, what's Rabbi Chia is talking about? Bipsila da aspasta. But basically, there's a very long stalk, and this long stalk was, so Rabbi Chia was not talking about a basket full of food that the animal pushed from one domain to another. He was talking about a long stalk that was placed partially in the private domain and partially in the public domain. So the animal eats it from one side, then what's going to happen is the second side is going to automatically follow it. And so therefore, we look at every single bag or package as though it's placed in a place where the animal could eat it. And so therefore, we can't prove from there to the case of a basket full of food. So when Rabbi Chia says that you're liable for the stuff inside, that's because that part was inside, but the other part was outside. And so therefore, we look at the case differently. So the Gemara now says the next case that it said in our Mishnah that if the animal ate the clothing or the utensil, that's meshuna. It's an unusual action. He has to pay half damages. And what are we talking about? That when they say half damages in the domain of the nizak, but if it's in the domain in Rishus Harabim, you're going to be exempt. And I remember when we studied this, Jeff said, why are you exempt in the public domain? You should be liable because it is goring. So the Gemara says, let's first analyze this statement that says you're exempt. Ahai. What's it referring to? Is it referring to the entire statement? That's what Rav says. Rav says akulu. It's said on both statements. It's referring to where that basically basically we're saying that the animal, and if the animal ate the food or the utensils in the private domain or the public domain, you're going to be exempt. Meaning, say if it ate in the public domain, you're going to be exempt. So that's what the Gemara is talking about. Meaning to say, the Gemara's question is, when it says you're exempt for eating in the public domain, is that just normal eating, or also mishuna, which would otherwise be karen? So Rav says akulo, that even for eating unusual activity in the public domain, you're going to be exempt. My timer, because even though this person, because what happened was this person put his clothing and utensils in the public domain, he shouldn't have done it. And so therefore, even though the animal came and ate it when it wasn't supposed to, this other person had done something wrong by placing it there. And so therefore, the animal that ate from it is going to be exempt. Shmuel Amar Lo Shanu Ella Peres V'Yarako. Shmuel says, when do we say that the animal that eats from the food in the public domain is exempt? Only if it eats in the normal manner, if it eats fruits and vegetables. However, ksus and kalim chayeves, but if it eats the food or the clothing or the utensils, which is mishuna, it's karen, he's going to be liable. V'chein amar Reish Lakish akul. Reish Lakish agrees with Rav that he's saying that you're going to be exempt for eating the clothing or utensils in the public domain, because the person shouldn't have put it there in the first place. For us, the Reish Lakish time and Reish Lakish follows his logic. The Amar Reish Lakish shtei paros rishus harabim. Let's say you have two cows that are just in the public domain. Achas revutza, achas malachas. One cow is squatting and one cow is walking. Ubata malachas the revutza, and the animal that's walking kicks the animal that's crouching. Petura, he's going to be exempt, even though generally speaking you're liable for kicking because it's goring. But since the animal that was squatting was not supposed to be squatting in the public domain, and so therefore, since it was doing its own unusual activity, your animal kicking it is going to be exempt. Revutza b'maleches, but let's say the animal that was squatting kicked the one that was walking, then it's going to be liable because your animal has a right to walk there. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lo Shanu Ela Peres V'Yarako. Rabbi Yochanan agrees with Shmuel. Says, when do we say that you're exempt? Only if it eats the normal food of fruit and vegetables. But if it eats the food or the clothing, it's going to be liable because it's karen. So do you want to say that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't follow this position of Reish Lakish? Whoever changes from the normal activity and then somebody else comes and changes after him, the second one is exempt. And even in this case of two cows, that if your animal kicks the cow that's squatting, you're going to be liable. The Gemara says, no, no, really, Rabbi Yochanan holds like Reish Lakish. But what's the reason why he says by food or clothing, if your animal eats the food or clothing, you're going to be liable? Because people typically leave their clothes in the public domain for a moment. They leave their utensils there. You put down your bag in public for a moment. And so therefore, it's not considered to be an action that's mishuna. And so therefore, if the animal did this and the other animal eats it, the animal that eats is going to be liable. But it's not okay for an animal to squat in the public domain. Okay, then we learned in the Mishnah that even though a shane, if a tooth eats, it's going to be exempt in the public domain. Nevertheless, you have to pay for the benefit that the animal got. Bava Kamma, how much do you have to pay? Rabba Amar Demei Amir. He says you have to pay for the value of basically, you have to pay for the value of straw. That even if the animal ate barley and it filled up on barley, which is very fancy food for an animal, you really only have to pay the minimum amount that you could have fed the animal, which is straw. But Rabba Amar Demei Sa'orim Basol. Rabba says, no, you pay for cheap barley, which is basically 2/3 the equivalent of the barley. Tanya Kavasi de Rabba, but Tanya Kavasi de Rabba. Tanya Kavasi de Rabba. We have a price that's like Rabba. Shimon Yochai says, Ein Meshalames El Dmei Amir Bavad. Rabbi Shimon Yochai says, you only pay the value of straw. But Tanya Kavasi de Rabba, Im Nehenes Meshalames Mashanenes. If you benefit, you pay what you benefit. Okay, it's not Achal Kav Kabayim. If it ate one kav or two kavs, Ein Omerim Teshalim Dmeyen. We don't make you pay exactly the right amount. We estimate how much would a person want to feed an animal, and even though it typically wouldn't eat that, you estimate it. So therefore, so if it ate something that's bad for it, it would be completely exempt because there he doesn't benefit at all. And now we're going to go into a very, very powerful sugya. Very powerful sugya. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Chisda Rami Bar Kamma. So Rav Chisda says to Rami Bar Kamma, you weren't with us last night in the base medrash, and therefore you weren't able to discuss the shiloh that we were discussing. The bailon mile mal yasa, because we had a very great question that we were discussing. And Amar my mila mal yasa. So Rami Bar Kamma says, what was the very important thing you were discussing? Amar way hadar b'chatzar chaveros. Rav Chisda said to Rami Bar Kamma, we have the following case. Let's say you live in your friend's field, in your friend's house, shalomi daito, without his consent, without his knowledge. So somebody goes away on their Thanksgiving vacation, somebody else moves into his house. Do you need to pay him for staying there? Now, what's the case we're talking about? If you want to say it's a house, a courtyard that you would never rent, and the guy who would never pay for rent, then of course you shouldn't need to pay him. The guy who wouldn't have paid anyway didn't get any benefit because anyways he wouldn't have paid anything. And this guy who typically would never rent it, he wasn't missing anything. Do you want to say it's a courtyard that you typically would rent out? And a guy who would typically pay his rent, of course you have to pay. This guy is benefiting by not paying his rent, and the other guy's benefiting. The other guy's losing because he can't collect rent. So the Gemara therefore says, we're talking about a case. We're talking about a case where a guy would never have rented out his house, but the guy who went in there would typically have paid rent. What would be the law there? Can the guy who's staying in the house say, listen, you didn't lose anything. You weren't going to rent out your house anyway. You went on vacation. You locked up the door. You went to the Bahamas. So what do you care that I spent a few nights there? Or maybe the guy who owns the house said, you should have to pay me. You benefited. You're staying in my house. Pay me what the going rate is on Airbnb on top of Chafam base. So this is what they said to Rami Bar Kamma. So this is what Rav Chisda said to Rami Bar Kamma. So Rami Bar Kamma responds, let's bring a proof from our Mishnah. So Rami Bar Kamma says to Rav Chisda, it's a Mishnah. So Rav Chisda says to him, Hi Masnisin, which Mishnah are you talking about? First do something for me, and then I'll tell you what Mishnah it is. So Shakal Sudre, he took his cloak and karachayt and he folded it up for him. He wanted to say, if you want me to teach you Gemara, you have to treat me like your Rebbe and basically serve me. So he says, which Mishnah? It says if the animal ate in the public domain, he has to pay according to the value that he ate. So you see from here that if you benefit, you have to pay. So Rav Chisda accepted that. So Rava, when he heard this, said, I don't understand. I don't understand just how incredible Rami Bar Kamma doesn't even recognize how much help he got from a god. This case is not all similar. The case of the guy who's staying in somebody else's courtyard is not all similar to the case of our Mishnah, and yet Rav Chisda accepted it. Hi Nana, hi Zed Nana, v'zeh chaser. This case in our Mishnah is where the animal benefited and the guy who owned the food was missing it. V'hai, whereas the case of the courtyard was Zed Nana, v'zeh lo chaser. It's a totally different case. It's one guy is benefiting, but the other guy is not missing anything. So it's not the same as the animal eating the food. The Rami Bar Kamma, so why did Rami Bar Kamma think that this was a good answer? Because he says, Stam Peiros, Pershus Aram, he says most fruits that you leave on the side in the public domain, Afkuri Mafkaruhu, we can assume that they're ownerless. And so therefore the person has indeed benefited from these fruits because the person is not actually losing anything because the fruits were ownerless, so they were already lost. So now the Gemara wants to try to figure out what's the answer to this question. If one person's benefiting, but the person he's benefiting from is not losing anything, what's going to be the law? So let's bring up Mishnah from Bava Basra. So the Mishnah in Bava Basra has the following case. Tanan. And Rashi has a drawing about this over here. So basically there's Reuven's fields on three sides surround Shimon's field, which is in the center of Reuven's field on three sides. So Hamakif Chavera Mishalosh Ruchosef. So somebody surrounds his friend on three sides and he builds a fence around it. So he surrounds him on three sides and he builds a fence there on side one, side two, and side three. So we don't make Shimon pay his share of the fence because he doesn't benefit from this fence at all because his field is still open on the fourth side. Haravias, this would imply that if he does make a fence on the fourth side, we would make Shimon pay Reuven for the other three sides. Now we see from here, so even though Shimon is benefiting and Reuven's not losing anything because he would have built that fence anyway, and because Reuven anyway had to make a fence for his fields, but still Shimon would pay if the fourth field was surrounded. And so we see from here, you're liable to pay. The Gemara says, no, Shani Hasam, no, that case is different to Amrway because Reuven could say to Shimon, At garampli hakefa yisera, you caused me to make an extra fence, meaning to say, because if your field was not in the middle of my fields, I wouldn't have needed to make a fence at all. All my fields would have been surrounded, but now that since your field's in the middle, I need to surround the fields with a fence. And so therefore, this is not a case of Zen, this is a case of you're benefiting and I'm losing because I have to build this fence in the middle. So therefore, it's not a proof. So the Gemara says, Tashma Amar Rabbi Yossi. So we're going to try and bring a proof from Rabbi Yossi's position in that same Mishnah that you're exempt from Zenana v'zeh lo chaser. How? Amar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, "Im Amad, let's say Shimon stood up, and Nikaf v'gader asarvias. Let's say Shimon stood up and he made his own fence on the fourth side. Reuven made the first three sides the fence. Now Shimon stood up and made a fence on the four sides. Megalgul and avasakol. Now we make him pay for everything. Why? Because Taima the God of Nikef, because he stood up and did it on himself, and that proves that he wants it. Hamakif, but we learn from here. Let's say Reuven himself would have done the fourth field, Potter. Then Shimon would have been exempt. Potter. We see from here, if one benefits and the other one's not missing anything, he's exempt. Mar says, no, Shani As in that case is different. He says, no. The reason why Shimon would have been exempt is because he said, I didn't need such a fancy fence. You built a very fancy fence. I would have been okay with thorns, and that's why he would have been exempt. So the Gemara says, okay, let's bring another source to try and solve it. So one person owns the house, and the other person owns the top floor of the house, the attic. Shenafel, and they both fell down. Amar the person who owns the attic told the person who owns the house to build it, meaning to say, I need you to build the house so that I can build my second floor. But the guy who owns the bottom floor says, he says, I don't need to build it. All right, so then the guy who has the second floor builds the ground floor. And he could dwell on the bottom floor until the guy who owned the bottom floor pays him for his construction costs. So all he has to pay is for the costs of al-Sacharo, but the rent that he was living there, he doesn't have to pay. Meaning to say, he only has to pay for the construction costs when he's living there, but he doesn't have to pay him for the rent for living there. Shma mina, zenana v'zelo chaser. This guy is benefiting because he's living in the bottom floor, but the other guy's not missing anything because he didn't be able to live there anyway. So therefore, we see from here it's exempt. The Gemara says, no, Shani Asam, the Baisa La'aliyah Mashtami. Now that case is different because the house is like Meshubad, is like a lien on it to the attic, meaning to say, since the owner of the attic has a right to live on top of him, therefore he has the right to live in the house until he gives him his money for construction costs. And so therefore it's not the same as benefiting from the money of your friend. He's taking what he has a right to. So again, the Gemara is going to try and bring a proof. This time the Gemara says, the Gemara's proof is liable. Tashma Rabbi Yehuda Omer. What about Avzeh from that same Mishnah? He says, Avzeh hadar b'chatzer chavero. Also somebody who lives in his friend's courtyard, shalomi daito, without his permission, sarcha lo schar. He has to pay him. Shema mina, we learn from here, we see from here that if a person lives in his friend's courtyard without his intent, he needs to pay him for it. We see from here that you're liable. The Gemara says, no, Shani Asam, no, why do you have to pay if you're dwelling in his courtyard, in his house? Mishum shecharusi dash yasa. No, because if you go away, this guy's going to put wear and tear in the house. He's going to darken your walls. That's why he's liable. So therefore, it's not a good proof. So Shalchua Bei Rabbi Ami. So the people of the yeshiva they still didn't know how to resolve this case. Sent it to the house of Rabbi Ami. Amar, so Rabbi Ami said, "V'chima asolo uma chisro." So he says he didn't lose anything. So Maziko, he didn't do any damage. Excuse me. So therefore, he should be exempt to pay. Rabbi Abba says, "Nisyasha v'davar," meaning to say, let's look at it closely. Hadar shakua kamed Rabbi Bar Abba Amar Kuli Hai Shakuli va'azli, meaning to say they sent this question to me so many times. Ilu ashka batami ba'ataima. If I had found a good explanation, don't you think I would have sent it to them? So meaning to say, if I would have found something by now, I would have sent it to them. Okay, so the Gemara says, Itmar Rav Kahana Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Eno tzarcha alos chasar. If you live in the friend's courtyard without his knowledge, zenen of zel chaser, you don't have to pay him. And Amar Papa Hadi Rabbi Avo Rav Ferish Maral Mikalei. He only learned it out from a general rule, not explicitly. The Tanan, not al evano korashalaktish. Let's say if the treasurer took a stone or a beam that belonged to the temple, hareza mal, that's not considered trespassing because he didn't change anything. It's still the temple's. Nisano chaver, once he gives it to his friend, to mal, then his friend has misappropriated it. Because the treasurer was misappropriated because he gave it to his friend, and so therefore he took it out from hektish to chumon. The chaver lo mal, but his friend didn't misappropriate it because by the time he got it, it was no longer hektish, but bano asof base. So let's say he builds his house with it. Let's say the treasurer built his house within Harzel lo mo achayadar tokter. He hasn't used it yet until he lives under it. Until he lives under the value of a penny's worth. That's only that which we said that if he builds it, he hasn't misappropriated it. That's only if he put it on top of the skylight, meaning he didn't build it with it. It's in the same status. And so those Samaras, that if you dwell in your friend's house without his consent, that's like that you have to pay for it because that's like dwelling under the beam of hektish. This shasik, Rabbi Yochanan was quiet, so he was suffering the shasik modoi. So therefore, Rabbi Avo thought that from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan was quiet, he agrees with this, that's the case of zen and of zelo chasar, and you're liable. Rabbi Yochanan wasn't even paying attention to his question because how can you say by a hektish that's without consent? Because the divine presence always has das. So if you have benefit from hektish without its knowledge, it's like benefiting with their knowledge. And so therefore it's a totally different case. So therefore, the Gemara hasn't resolved this question. God willing, we'll pick this up. We're going to study it again tomorrow night at 7:20, and then Thursday, I don't know what time Thursday morning, but we'll figure it out. Tomorrow morning, we're going to do it at 6:30 a.m. We'll go over this, God willing.